Figures. Still leaves the lights on every night. For the girl who only comes home once every other blue moon. Mom's an old-fashioned type like that.
Think she'll make us pizza? Her Midgar special?
She's quite the cook. Quick to whip up finger-licking food, even if you drop by in the dead of night.
And she loves guests who ask for seconds or thirds.
So you bought the right crew then.
Okay, let's head in. Cloud, you know what to do. Why don't you wait around the corner over there?
Okay.
It's a shame you won't get to try the Midgar special. You would have really liked it.
Such an insult. Like, you know what to do. You get to wait outside while we have pizza rolls. Why are they treating him so badly?
With your help,
He's
we won't
21.
need
Okay, I was
luck.
close. 18.
You'll
Not
take
too
on
far
just
off.
about any job, right? Well, I need you to rob my house. Think you can do that for me?
Oh. What? But why? Why?
Go in through the back door when the coast is clear.
Kitty.
The signal will be obvious.
What's wrong with the last cat? Oh, it's Fluffy.
Once the lights come on, it's go time.
Thanks, Rick. We appreciate that.
Time to go.
Wait, which way are we supposed to go in? Oh, here. Oh, it's so slow. Suddenly we've forgotten the ability of how to
Inside,
walk.
you'll find a room with 2 doors. Don't take the one in front of you. You
Rob
want the
my
room
mum,
on the
please.
right. That's where you'll find it.
On the right, okay.
Sorry about dropping in like this again. We'll be chatting Mom up in the kitchen, so don't even bother being quiet. There's no way she'll ever hear you.
Yeah, why the hell is he so slow though? I thought he was being slow to not
Dad'll
make a
be in
noise,
there, but it's okay.
Oh no. Daddy, no.
I need you to grab his Shinra ID card. And yeah, I know I should do it myself, but... but I honestly don't think I'm up to it. Just do this for me, okay?
Yes, we'll break the law for you.
Yeah, like a dog.
This isn't it.
Now this.
Shinra
This is
ID.
what I've been waiting
Shinra
for.
ID. If I was a Shinra ID, where would I be? On the floor. Thanks for the sub. Celtics.
What's this?
Let's read a letter.
Dear Mom and Dad, sorry for not getting in touch sooner, but I'm working at the Gold Saucer as an actress now. It
Lies.
wasn't easy, and I had a lot of help from people along the way, but I managed to land a starring role. And closed our 2 tickets to my play.
James Franco is a
Look
dad.
forward to seeing you both there.
Jesse Raspberry as... the princess?
This is amazing.
She was trying to. She was an actress? Maybe it's on his suit.
My dad, he was a maintenance supervisor at the reactor.
Oh god, we're gonna fail this mission. Aha!
Thanks.
You've still got room, Wedge?
You think he has radiation poisoning? Oh man.
Thank you.
Be quiet, Cloud. Jesus. So what happens if we fail? Do we get
Mission
invited in
accomplished.
for dinner?
When are you going to give up on the gold saucer? How long has it been since you even performed?
A lot of people really rely on Jesse.
Good evening and welcome to what we have been calling the debate of the century between Dr. Nigel Cameron and Dr. Peter Singer. My name is Jennifer Lahl and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Bioethics and Culture here in Oakland. We expect this to be a very interesting evening, a very enlightening evening, but most of all, we expect this to be an evening that will deeply impact each of you who is here tonight. The question to be debated tonight, what does it mean to be human, is of paramount importance. There are visionaries now who are talking about a post-human or a transhuman race. People are proposing to clone human beings either for reproduction or for research purposes. Our culture is divided on the abortion issue, and there are issues regarding the degree and the nature of medical treatment for those nearing the end of their lives, as well as for those who are disabled. Should we restrain scientific discovery? And what should be our ethical framework for understanding the boundaries that we put into place? In each of these very critical matters that affect our culture, our society, and our lives, this issue of what does it mean to be human is one of the central matters that must be taken into consideration. It gets beyond the symptom of differing views and addresses the fundamental and the foundational issues surrounding our humanness. The CBC is deeply aware of the strongly held viewpoints on both sides of tonight's debate. Each of these men tonight has much to say on these matters. Dr. Nigel Cameron is the executive chairman of the CBC. He is founder of the international journal Ethics in Medicine, Executive Chair of the Center for Bioethics and Public Policy in London, and Dean of the Wilberforce Forum in Washington, D.C. He has testified before the United States Senate, has appeared frequently on television shows such as Nightline, and is the author of The New Medicine, Life and Death After Hippocrates. And he's also most recently served as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations Task Force on Human Cloning. It is our privilege to have him participate with us this evening's debate. Dr. Peter Singer is known worldwide for his seminal writings in the field of bioethics and his staunch defense of animal rights, and he holds a position at Princeton University as the Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Center for Human Values. Among his many books are Animal Liberation, Rethinking Life and Death, and Writings on an Ethical Life. We are privileged to have him participate in this evening's debate. Michael Krasny is well known here in the Bay Area in his role as the host of KQED Forum on KQED FM radio, and is also an author and a professor of literature. Mr. Krasny will be serving as the moderator of this debate in a format that he and the debate principals have arranged and agreed upon, and we are very pleased to have his participation as our moderator. An archival videotape is being made of this event, and you will note from your program that no other photography or recordings are permitted this evening. There will be a time for questions from the audience, during which you will have an opportunity to bring questions to either Dr. Cameron or Dr. Singer. We know that the matters being discussed and debated tonight are very weighty. That is why we are putting on this event, and that many of you hold very strong convictions about them. Yet we ask for your graciousness, your courtesy, and your respect for all participants. Finally, the CBC would like to thank its co-organizer, Life Legal Defense Foundation, and our co-sponsors, the California Pro-Life Council, the Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity, First Resort, the Howard Center for Family, Religion, and Society, Respect Life Ministry, and the Wilberforce Forum. We thank them for their support and vision in helping us put together the debate of the century. I now give you Mr. Michael Krasny, who will explain the format and the rules by which this debate will be conducted.
Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to all of you. Delighted to have you here this evening for what promises to be certainly a fascinating debate. I think, just out of curiosity, how many of you heard the preliminary round on the radio on the forum program? Okay, great. Diminish suffering both look at the world, however, through very different lenses, and they have both, however, agreed about one thing, and that is the structure of this debate. And what we're going to do is hear from each of them. I'll flip a coin. This is very much in the old American style of football, and whoever wins the coin toss will get to decide whether they want to go first or whether they want to extend the right to their opponent to go first. And then each will give a 10-minute opening statement, after which I will begin to ask them questions based not only on, of course, the content that they present, but also on many of the issues. Then we'll have the questions that many of you were kind enough to put forward here. We probably will get only to a selected number of them, so if we don't get to yours, my apologies ahead of time, but we'll do the best we can. And we will certainly have, I hope, a good wide range of questions from the audience. So without any further ado, we're going to begin, and let me begin by introducing the two who are vying for certainly not only your goodwill, but also to win you over and persuade you of their points of view, Drs. Peter Singer and Nigel Cameron. Please welcome them. Thank you kindly for that welcome, and I know that our participants appreciate it. Who would like to call the coin that I'm about to flip here? Would you like to take that?
Sure, I'll call.
Okay. This is for Peter Singer. Call it in the air, heads or tails?
Heads.
Tails it is, which means, Nigel Cameron, you get the decision as to who goes first here.
I shall be happy to go first.
Again, Nigel Cameron will have 10 minutes, at which time I will tell him that his 10 minutes is up, and then we'll hear 10 minutes from Peter Singer. So please proceed.
Let me offer you 3 propositions this evening. The first proposition is this: that at the heart of every culture, at the very root of every civilization, is a vision of what it means to be human, what it means to be one of us. This is true whether you live in a primitive tribal culture, whether you live in Islamic or Chinese civilization. It's true of every culture the world around. It's true of secular societies as well as religious societies. There is a vision at the core of the culture of what it means to be one of us. And therefore, at the end of the day, every great cultural question reduces to this question, or to turn that statement around. The question of what it means to be human lies behind every great question debated in the culture. Now, I believe that to be true of all the great controversies around us, whether the controversy is about public education, about porn on the internet, about funding for health care, whether it's about euthanasia or abortion, whether it's about biotechnology, whether it's about the standards we have in our public life, the standards in our political life, truth-telling in business, Enron and Arthur Anderson. At the end of the day, every question ultimately depends upon your vision of what it means to be one of us, to be a member of this human community. And that is why So many issues are hard to address, hard to disagree and agree on, because we fail to see the question behind them. That is why these questions of human dignity in healthcare, questions of discrimination, questions of handicap, questions of the lives of the born and the unborn, questions of biotechnology, which all come so very close to the question of what it means to be human, are freighted with such fateful consequences and go to the very root of what our civilization is all about. My first point. Second point. The question of what it means to be human is being tried in our generation as it never has been for many hundreds of years. You see, we are the legatees of what we have been pleased to call Judeo-Christian civilization, of a culture founded over many hundreds of years on highly distinct moral and spiritual values, a culture founded on an amalgam of traditions, the great classical civilization of the ancient world, taken by the Jewish and Christian writers and thinkers, molded into the Christendom of the Middle Ages, out of which has come, in modern times, the nation-states of the West. Highly complex history, but through it all, running down now hundreds of years, at the heart of this civilization, a vision of human dignity, which is grand and glorious, a vision of human being made in the very image of God. And whether you are Christian or Jewish or Muslim, whether you are sacred or secular, whatever your religious, philosophical starting point today, you are the legatee and the beneficiary of that vision of human dignity, which has given rise in the Western tradition to the rule of law, to democracy, to the flowering of the dignity of the individual, and late in the day, in this last generation, to the second round in the debate about the ending of slavery, in the civil rights movement, in this last generation, to many of the good aspects of feminism and the recovery of the dignity of women, given rise to our concerns in our generation for those who are handicapped through ADA, through so many regulatory and policy positions, a recognition of the equal dignity before the law of those who have been considered to have equal dignity under God. In our generation, the most fateful questions being posed against the background of the flowering of our vision for human dignity and of our finding ourselves often the unwitting beneficiaries of this highly distinct Judeo-Christian moral vision in which the individual matters quite so much because the individual matters the God who made him or who made her. Thirdly, as to the future, we find ourselves at the watershed in the history of this civilization, the breakpoint of our culture. We find ourselves addressing fundamental questions which have not been addressed for many hundreds of years. And I think the issue of euthanasia perhaps has been the most evident of them all, because euthanasia was eschewed, euthanasia was prohibited, euthanasia was regarded as just about as bad a thing as could be in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as the abandonment of the sick, at the same time as the abandonment of our moral responsibility for ourselves. In this last generation, the prohibition on suicide has been overturned in our moral thinking, and euthanasia is advanced in Europe, practiced now in Holland, now in Belgium, the law, in Oregon here, our own sample euthanasia jurisdiction. A beginning of a reinvention of human nature, a decision that human nature may be disposed of that we, in our autonomy, may end our own lives, and of course, by implication, that there are lives less worthy to be lived than other lives. The beginning of a development which, of course, in Germany in the 30s and 40s led to the world's great euthanasia regime, and leaves the German conscience as the great guide to our address of issues in medicine and biotechnology in the world today. Let the German conscience be your guide. As we look ahead, we look beyond issues like euthanasia and the status of the handicapped, the disabled. We look to the manipulative capacities of biotechnology, to cloning, to germline interventions that will change every generation, to these new powers we have taken to ourselves in the biosciences, which are being exploited not, as it were, within the academy and the professional scientific community, so much as within the IPO world of the biotech companies and venture capitalists, as the marketing of bioscience threatens to engulf and indeed fundamentally to change the whole character of our culture, because it has lost touch with this vision of human nature as that bearing the dignity of the God who has made us, because we have come to the view that human nature is now manipulable and is in our own hands, that we can not just dispose of ourselves in euthanasia, we can remake ourselves through biotechnology. So we may choose to clone ourselves, we may choose to have better babies, we may choose to find some way to dispense with inheritable disease, we may choose to make a post-human future in which human nature is something we control. We may choose to move beyond taking human life made in God's image into making human life in the image of ourselves. What does it mean to be human? To be human in our civilization has been a grand and glorious thing, because it has been to be made in the image of the God who made us. And religious or secular, we are the beneficiaries of that great tradition, and we tamper with it at our peril. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel Cameron. We now extend the 10-minute opening to Dr. Peter Singer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me first begin by rephrasing this debate to some extent, because I actually don't agree with Dr. Cameron that the question, what it means to be human, is an important question. Dr. Cameron gave another alternative rendering of it. What does it mean to be one of us? That's perhaps getting closer, but I also don't think it's quite the right question to ask. Let me just spend a minute or two to say why. If you ask what it means to be human, it's perfectly possible to give that a straightforward biological sense. To be human is to be a member of the species Homo sapien. And a lot of the ethical debates that we've been having, for example, debates about abortion and about research on embryos, has been in terms of the question, are they human beings? As if somehow that would settle the issue. President Bush, for example, in that statement he made on August the 9th, 2001, about research on embryos, said something like, the question is whether they are human and therefore something precious to be protected from destructive research. But I think that that's too swift a move. Because I have no doubt that the embryos that were under discussion that President Bush was talking about are human. They are human in the sense of being members of the species Homo sapien. And I have no doubt that they are alive, so they are living human beings. But for me, that does not answer any significant ethical questions. It just tells you their species, and it tells you that they're alive. Behind that, there is an ethical assumption that if a being is a living human being, then it must have, it ought to have, all of the rights and protections that we want to give ourselves, that we claim for ourselves. And that, I think, is exactly the assumption that you need to think about. It's the assumption that needs to be questioned. You shouldn't make that easy assumption that if a being is biologically a member of our species, that being has the same rights that all of us here have. Because why should species membership be morally crucial? Why should the fact that you biologically belong to this species, you have a certain number of chromosomes, a certain arrangement of the genes, why should that be morally important? Suppose that you encountered a friendly alien. Maybe some of you have been to see E.T. in its revived form recently. Suppose you encounter a being like E.T. who has a range of emotions and feelings at least as deep as we do, and intellect at least as powerful or more powerful than we do. But is clearly not a human being. No question that E.T. is not a human being, not a member of the species Homo sapien. He's one of these, leathery-skinned aliens, so not a human being. But would anyone think that because E.T. is not a human being, therefore it would be okay to kill him and dissect him to find out how he's going? I think no one who's seen that film could possibly think that the fact that E.T. is not a human being means that E.T. lacks the rights that you or I have. So if that's so, then not being human doesn't mean that you lack rights. And conversely, I would argue that being human doesn't mean necessarily that you have them. So that if we take, for example, and certainly this is an extreme case, but it is a case that exists, if we take an infant born with anencephaly, that is a condition where essentially there is no brain, there is still a brain stem that functions, so anencephalic infants are not brain dead under the law, they are living human beings, but they have no cortex. So we know that they can never, not only can they never learn to think or reason or speak or some of these higher intellectual capacities, they can also never, for example, recognize their mothers. They will never smile when their mother comes into the room and picks them up. They don't have the consciousness required for that. But this is a human being. I would say, however, that this being does not have the same rights to life that you or I, beings with very different capacities, do have because of those capacities and, for example, our abilities to think about our lives, to plan our lives, to have hopes and wishes for the future, all of which I think would make it very seriously wrong to end our lives against our will in a way that it would not be wrong to end the life of an anencephalic infant. And in fact, if you look at the policies, excuse me, you'll get a chance to ask questions later if you'd mind just listening. If you look at the policies that are practiced in every hospital in this country,
Sir, would you kindly sit down? We're going to conduct this in a civil way.
Well, you may judge for yourself whether you consider that a useful contribution to the debate or not, but if I may continue. There is, in every hospital in this country, infants born with anencephaly will not be treated like babies born without that condition. They will not be put on respirators to keep them alive, unless, as happened in one or two very rare cases, the parents, perhaps fundamentalist Christians, will insist on that treatment, and then it may be done. But generally, the vast majority of doctors and parents will think that it's best to allow that child to die. In other words, they're making a judgment that it's better that this child not live. The child could live, perhaps, with intensive care for quite a long time, for years. But in allowing that child to die, a judgment is being made that the child's life is not one that is worth preserving. That's, I think, a reasonable judgment to make. But those who make it, I think, are not following through that judgment if they say that it's only permissible to allow that infant to die, that it would be wrong to take active steps to assist that infant to die. Because I don't really think that's an important moral distinction. The crucial question is this a being whose life we want to preserve or not? And if we're allowed to decide that we don't want to preserve it, I think the rest is basically a technicality about the means that we use to achieve that end. So let me say then that for that reason, I don't think the important question is whether a being is human or not. The important question is, firstly, is this a being of moral significance to whom we have moral obligations? And my view is that what's required for that is not whether the being is human or not, but whether the being has a capacity to experience anything, to feel pain or suffering, or conversely, to enjoy life. If the being has that capacity, then we can make its life go well or badly, and it makes a difference to that being what its life is like. So yes, then the being is a being of moral significance, and we have moral obligations toward it, basically, at least to try and reduce its suffering, to alleviate its suffering, or to try and make that being's life go better. And this is true generally of human beings, although not, I think, of anencephalics, because they don't have that capacity to feel pleasure or pain. And it's also true, of course, of many non-human animals. At least, I would say, of every vertebrate non-human animal. We could argue about whether it's true of some invertebrates or not. So they are also morally significant beings. And on that question of the suffering of pain, the boundary between our species and theirs is not so crucial. Like them, we can feel pain. They can share those pains too. And it matters. Pain matters whether it's a human, a pig, a chimpanzee, a cow, a chicken, whatever. But a second question can also be asked. Even if a being can feel pain, even if a being is conscious, should it be regarded as having the same right to life that you and I have? Let's say, should it be regarded as having the strongest possible claim to life of any beings that we know? And here I would say, mere consciousness is not enough. Certainly, if a being can have a good life, enjoy our life, that's a reason why it's good for that being to live. But there are worse things than ending the life of a being which does not have any sense of its own life existing over time. And a worse thing is to end the life of a being who can have a sense of existing over time and can want to go on living. Because then you are thwarting the desires and preferences of that being to have his or her life in a way that you cannot do for a being who does not have that capacity. So that's why it seems to me that these are the important things to look at, not the questions of whether beings are human or not, or even the questions of whether they're one of us. Unless by us you mean one of us here, that is, one of us who are capable of understanding an abstract argument, listening to it, and responding intellectually to it. Of course, that's a very narrow group and does not include all human beings, and I wouldn't want to place the threshold so high, even in terms of what kinds of beings have a right to life. Let me just say one final thing. In response to what Dr. Cameron said, I think you need to beware of rhetorical slides of the kind that he used when he moved from speaking of Holland and Oregon, which have laws allowing people to choose to end their lives under certain conditions and with certain safeguards, to Nazi Germany, and to talk about what happened in Nazi Germany as euthanasia. Because the people who were killed by the Nazis, whether in the so-called euthanasia program or simply in the so-called final solution to the Jewish question, wanted to go on living, or certainly did not want to die, nor did their families, nor were their families involved or consenting in the decision that they should not continue to live. It's a completely different situation when you have a state deciding that for its own purposes from what happens in Holland now or in the state of Oregon. And I think you need to think more in a more nuanced way about those distinctions than Dr. Cameron suggested to you. I think I've used my 10 minutes.
I think you have. Thank you. Let me begin with a question for you, Peter Singer. I think that many of those who are concerned, as we can see by the show this evening, many from the disabled community, are concerned with the premise with which you began, that you are perhaps, and I think Dr. Cameron hinted at this in his opening remarks, you're perhaps leading down a moral slope, a brain injury, for example, as opposed to having no brain. I think particularly of my mother in a neurological state where she couldn't communicate, she was lying there with a feeding tube in her, she was immobile, didn't appear to have any consciousness, but may have been in some kind of neurological state where her consciousness was not evident. There are many of those gray areas still medically that can't be defined. So would you address initially the concern that many have that once you begin making the decisions of this sort, in fact you said we must decide, is this a being whose life we want to preserve or not? First of all, who makes that decision? And then where do you decide not to decide? Or where do you decide the decision has gone too far or has traversed a boundary that is too extreme?
Well, when I said, you sometimes have to decide, I was thinking of cases of infants. And obviously with infants, the infant cannot decide him or herself. So someone has to make that decision. I've always argued that the primary role in decision-making should be that of the parents. The parents are the ones who normally, not in every case, but normally can be expected to have the best interests of their child at heart. They certainly need advice. They certainly need information. Sometimes they can get some information from their physicians, but I think they should be open to the widest range of sources, and I certainly think that those of you here from the disability movement have a role in providing advice to parents about what kind of life their child with a disability can have and how that child can be supported if that's the decision they wish to make. But I think in the end, primarily the decision should be theirs in consultation with their physicians, and only in cases of really rather bizarre decisions where the physicians would not be prepared to go along with that should there be a need to resort to appeal to a higher body, perhaps to a court, perhaps to a bioethics committee or something of that sort. In the case of older people like the ones you mentioned, ideally we should try and ask them beforehand while they're still in a state where they can think about what they would like to happen to them in a range of eventualities which we know could happen to us all. And so they then should be the ones who have that say. It will sometimes happen, nevertheless, that we have no such information. And then it becomes difficult. I think all we can do is make the best judgment we can of what is in the person's interests on the basis of the information that we have. And that's not going to be perfect. But you can't really, you said something, I think, Michael, about deciding not to decide. You can't actually do that in these cases. And not deciding is a decision, one way or the other. It may be not deciding to provide life support and then the patient will die, or it might be not deciding to withdraw life support and then the patient will live. And maybe then the patient will live in pain and distress without any redeeming qualities for 6 months and then die, in which case I would say you've made the wrong decision. So inevitably it is a decision. It can be a tough one, but I think we just have to do the best we can.
And we have to accept the possibility that the wrong decisions can be made and that the technological and biotechnological revolution might even allow for example, infants to be saved from the kind of fate that we might decree upon them, or their parents might decide with physician consultation is the right fate for them?
Well, certainly. I think we are always bound by human fallibility and error. And if I'm right in saying that we have to make a decision either way, then sometimes we'll make decisions that are mistakes. As I said, sometimes we'll keep a child alive who will just suffer miserably and die many months or even years later. Sometimes we will end the life of a child who perhaps could have had a quality of life that we would, had we known what the child would have, thought was much worthwhile. So yes, we can't really avoid making mistakes one way or the other.
Well, Dr. Cameron, I imagine from your perspective that's unacceptable, particularly since you say we all belong to the same human community. But I want to come back to something that Dr. Singer said about why species membership alone should mean moral importance or crucial moral weight. In your judgment, if you would.
Well, one of Peter Singer's contributions to the English language has been his promotion of the term speciesism, which I believe others have also used, but he's very much made it his own, as a way of designating those of us who happen to believe that being a member of the human species is of the highest moral significance, are somehow guilty of the same kind of prejudicial approach as those who would take the view that being a member of this particular sex or ethnic group sexism, racism, and this is an analogical concept. I think that's a fair assessment of his proposal. And that therefore there must be some other way of deciding who really matters, who is one of us, who is part of the human moral community to whom we will attribute the kind of special character such that we treat them in the way we would treat ourselves. Now, I think without prejudice to the fact that plainly other creatures, whether E.T. Or the so-called lower animal orders, may indeed be accorded special treatment for good reasons, it does seem to me that the indivisibility of human dignity and the, if you like, the moral flip side of human species membership is a bedrock of the kind of vision of human worth in which most of us believe.
Does that make us above the animal world in your judgment, then?
It makes us different from the animal world in that it seems to me if our beloved black lab breaks her leg, for example, Miriam, my daughter, is here, who is really her best friend in this world. If Charlie, who is 15 now, I think, were to break her leg, we would have to consider having her put down. If Miriam breaks her leg, I don't think we take that view. And I hope we wouldn't take that view even if Miriam, were 7 times her age and rather elderly. It seems to me we have an intuitive differential in the way in which we regard humans and non-humans for whom we have great affection.
If Miriam were suffering, however, and you saw no end, no plausible end to that suffering, what then?
Well, I would get a different doctor. And it seems it seems to me to make a very serious point here. One of the most extraordinary features in this whole discussion, I was at a conference some years ago funded by Sir John Templeton, who you may know as a very wealthy man who funds many very good causes. And we were talking about the capacity of medicine to do things for people who were suffering. And he said that his grandfather had been a physician, which must have been about 100 years ago, because Sir John is now a very old gentleman. And he said that in that 100 years, perhaps we were now 100 times better able to intervene medically and really change the situation when somebody was sick. It's an amazing thing. Palliative medicine goes up like that. The development of the hospice movement goes up like that. My friends in the trade tell me it is very, very rare now for someone to have serious long-term pain that cannot be addressed medically. Very, very rare. And yet, support for euthanasia goes up like that. A generation ago, suffering was much, much greater. And yet, the decision to end someone's life intentionally was something that was not to be considered within the moral community.
What about Dr. Singer's example of an infant born without a brain, without a cortex, no consciousness? Do we, because we have certainly the technology, just prolong that infant's life as the infant continues to grow old and not even consider the possibility that perhaps the infant is in a special category all of its own?
I think the question of anencephaly is a very difficult one. I think that some of you may know that up at Loma Linda there was a scandal, huge controversy, some 20 years ago, when there was interest in taking anencephalic children who had not died and using them as organ donors. And I believe the practice ceased after the controversy. They were considered to be wonderful live organ donors who really were barely human. Seems to me that there are issues of medical futility involved in treating babies who have a very short lifespan ahead of them, and in this case have apparently no consciousness. And I think that is the context in which we have the conversation. I think the notion that we act intentionally to terminate their lives because we consider those lives are not worth living because they are not conscious is a very different question. If I can give a brief parallel case, I mean, the question of the persistent vegetative state is the one typically advanced here also, where people apparently have no consciousness for very long periods. And the record of somebody in PVS is over 30 years of survival in this state. And I was in a debate some years ago, and someone put this to me, and they said, but surely this proves that we should not be sustaining people in this state if they can live that long. And I said, I find the story of this gentleman who was in that state for over 30 years one of the most extraordinary statements of the capacity of the human community to show love for each other in this condition of abject disability.
Peter Singer, I think it's fairly safe to say that much of Nigel Cameron's concern happens to be with not necessarily perhaps defining what is human, but eroding the sense of dignity that we attach to the idea of our humanity. And would you address that concern in as reasonable a way as you can? Because I'm sure that you can empathize with those who feel that once you begin, in other words, to question what is human, you can indeed erode the dignity of what is human.
I think the choice here is whether we are going to essentially try and disguise to ourselves, through the kind of language that Dr. Cameron has used, what actually goes on in medicine, or whether we're going to be honest and face up to it. Because I think that there is a real danger, if we're going to talk about dangers in doing things, I think there's a real danger in prolonging language of fiction. And you had an example from Dr. Cameron when he talked about the futility of prolonging the life of someone with anencephaly because they only have a short lifespan. Babies with anencephaly have a short lifespan because we don't generally put them on respirators. But if you did put them on respirators, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't, with all the medical technology that, as Dr. Cameron correctly said, has advanced so much in the years, there's no reason why you couldn't keep them alive for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And in what sense is that then futile? Well, of course, you might say, well, it's futile because they'll never recover consciousness. They'll never gain consciousness. But if you admit that that's why it's futile, then essentially you're saying that a human life is futile if it doesn't have consciousness. So you're accepting my point that it's not human life as such, but at least, at a minimum, a level of consciousness that is required to make life worthwhile. So in a whole range of different ways, I think we disguise to ourselves what we're doing. That's just one example. Another example is this idea of relieving pain when we know that we're actually shortening life. But by appealing to this doctrine of double effect, we tell ourselves that our intention is to relieve pain, and this is somehow vastly morally different from actually carrying out active euthanasia, although in both cases we're injecting doses of morphine that are shortening life. And in some cases, actually, we're making the person terminally unconscious. There's a practice in medicine known as terminal sedation, where you make someone unconscious until they die. Of course, if you're prepared to do that, then it's true that there's very, very few people, perhaps none, of whom palliative care cannot relieve pain, as you heard Dr. Cameron say. But do any of you here think that it would be a great idea, if you're terminally ill from cancer, for the doctor to keep you terminally sedated so that you're unconscious until you die, however long that takes? Is that really a lot better than the doctor giving you a single larger injection and killing you straight off, rather than allowing you to die in several weeks? I think not. I think there's a whole range of ways in which we are essentially trying to disguise to ourselves what we're doing, and I see that as dangerous. I also see as dangerous the denial of human freedom and autonomy, and I would say here dignity, that comes from telling people that they're not the ones who are going to choose how their life ends. We, either the doctor or the hospital or the state, are going to tell them how their life is going to end. We are going to tell them that we can relieve their suffering. It may not just be physical pain. It may be other things that are not so easy for palliative care to deal with. It may be weakness. It may be shortness of breath. It may be nausea. It may be the fact that they don't simply want to die in this condition. They don't want to be seen by their family to be have their capacities slowly eroding away. And to say, we are the ones who are going to decide how you die, not you. We are not going to allow you to have those rights and freedoms that the people of the Netherlands or of the state of Oregon now have, and the people of Belgium are about to get. That, I think, is indeed something that is more dangerous than the things that I've been suggesting.
Let me take a couple of those points and refer them to Nigel Cameron, because I think they're quite important in terms of the real essence of this debate. That is, Professor Singer is clearly saying that when you talk about the futility of medicine, you're acquiescing to the idea of what's tantamount to the fact that medicine really is ineffectual, therefore acquiescing to, in a sense, what he's saying. But beyond that, I think he's also raising a question about the autonomy of choice, and I'd be curious to know your response to that. That is, if someone can choose a death, they can choose a death with dignity. And since you have made dignity the centerpiece of a lot of your argument, what about that notion that having your own autonomy to die in a dignified way is a death with dignity that you can choose?
I think on the fertility issue, I think my point is that is the context in which you then have that conversation, whether it's about PVS, whether it's about anencephaly. I've never heard anyone suggest an anencephalic can live for 40 years before. This is, I mean, we'd have to have some physicians in the conversation to tease this out. But it seems to me that the principle here, I mean, there are immensely difficult situations in which we decide, do we treat, do we not treat, do we withdraw treatment because it isn't working? I mean, what are the parameters on which we begin and withdraw treatment? And these are very legitimate discussions in which, in a clinical context, we will have a very complex conversation. I think that is a proper conversation to have. I think it is a different conversation in kind from the conversation about whether we intentionally treat or not treat with a view to bringing about the end of the patient's life. And I think that principial distinction is it's part of the wall that divides civilization from barbarism. It's that important. Even if in individual cases, it may be very complex putting together the pieces of the conversation. On the issue of autonomy, I find it's a very interesting conversation indeed. Because the claim is made, it's made very loosely and believed by many people, that if we are to respect the autonomy of the individual, therefore we should allow euthanasia. It seems obvious, doesn't it? You know, which of the healthcare organizations was it that ran that campaign? It's my life, my body, my healthcare, whatever, something of this kind. And you pursue that argument. And you end up with the notion, and Dr. Singer says this, I mean, who are we to override the wishes of people who want to do A or B or C? And it seems to me if you have a 5-minute conversation about euthanasia, that is the way the discussion goes. Seems to me if you have an hour for the conversation, it goes a very different way, because you begin to run the movies. You begin to look at the scenarios. 2 or 3 key points here. One is, if you actually have a euthanasia regime in law in this country, one of the most immediate impacts it would have would be on health insurance. And we would find health insurance companies offering half-price policies or maybe quarter-price policies to young fit people who agreed that in the event of their getting A or B or C, they would opt for euthanasia. Autonomy, freedom, their choice. So if you're a low-wage earner, as I'm sure some of you are, and you can just afford health insurance, or your company hasn't offered it because they can't, you get cheap policies offered and you make those decisions. And so you say, because you've got 3 kids to support and a mortgage to pay, you will opt for the cheap policy. Now, what's happening to autonomy here? Something very disturbing is happening to it, because you're acting under economic duress and opting into the euthanasia program. Second example. The basic defense, autonomy defense of euthanasia is that if you don't want to be alive because you're sick, you ought not to have to be alive. But who talked about the question of being sick? That isn't the defense of euthanasia. That is the defense of a public policy approval of suicide. Now, how many in this room have not, at one point in their lives, woken up and wished they were dead? Not many of us. It isn't just the bad days we have at work. It isn't just the bad days we have with our families, our kids, and our spouses. Many go through depression, experience of depression, long-term depression, and many people have miserable situations for all kinds of reasons. And they might decide, it's my life, I choose not to be alive anymore. The moral justification for euthanasia is in fact a moral case for public policy approval of suicide. And of course the utterly random effects of such a policy are very evident. So I think there are a number of ways in which the easy notion that autonomy leads to euthanasia has led many people working in this field, interestingly, to say, okay, autonomy is impressive, but in this case, we begin to see in public policy, we should say no.
Help us understand a bit how, since you did tie this specifically to religion and you spoke about made in the image of the Creator and all of that, how you mentioned secular in the same fashion, and you say this includes secularism, that embraces the idea behind what you're arguing as a moral civilization and a civilization based on moral humanity. How are those who are non-believers or those who are not faith-anchored included in that?
Well, I know there are some unbelievers here because I know one or two of you.
Been a litmus test, huh?
It seems to me that there are two different issues here. I mean, for example, this discussion of euthanasia, I mean, this is not a religious conversation. It's a conversation about how we protect the weak in a culture in which the temptation to press people into death decisions can be unstoppable unless the culture protects the sanctity of life. Whatever you believe about God or non-God, those arguments I think are very telling. But secondly, I began by saying we are all the legatees of Judeo-Christian civilization, with its amalgam of classical and Judeo-Christian culture, which has given us the rule of law and a certain view of democracy and dignity of the individual, and the human rights movement. The human rights movement, delayed impact of the Enlightenment in public policy, extraordinarily important for the modern world. Now, why are we digging up war graves in Rwanda and in Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia? Why are we doing that? It's because we have a radical view of the dignity of the individual. And that has come to us through our religious heritage. You haven't got to believe the heritage, but let's hold on to the vision of human rights, which ultimately depends upon what Dr. Singer has called our speciesism, our view that to be human is to be uniquely significant.
Peter Singer, you alluded before to what you thought was an unfair rhetorical use by Dr. Cameron of an analogy to what he called German conscience, which obviously is the Nazis. How would you really address to those who are here who are concerned that this does lead to a slippery slope, I hate to use the cliche, that, in other words, there's a potential for eugenics, there's a potential for eliminating people's lives based on their disabilities. There are many people here, obviously, who have that concern. Some of them are protesting outside because they feel once you open this Pandora's box, you've got the possibility of people being eliminated just on the basis of their disability.
Well, essentially, I simply think that the analogy doesn't hold because what the situations that we're dealing with are quite different, and what's being proposed is quite different. On the one hand, you have a totalitarian state with a racist policy based on the preservation of the purity of the Aryan folk, which is, you know, a racial myth, which they consider certain people basically are a blot on the Aryan folk, and they are Jews and gypsies and people with disabilities, genetic disabilities, inherited disabilities. And this was therefore simply a program to get rid of those people, to eliminate them for the benefit of this mythical state. What I'm talking about is something that is not carried out by an authoritarian